live on YouTube, and we'll post the Facebook link, or we'll post the YouTube link on Facebook. That's kind of our backup. Let's see.
I'm glad you're handling it.
Yeah, okay, there we go. So we are going to be temporarily live, or we're going to be live on YouTube instead. Let me post this on the store's Facebook page real quick. Matt, can you text McKenna and just let her know we're going live on YouTube instead of Facebook? Okay. Okay, so that's going. Okay, so we're just going to give it a couple seconds for people to come over and find us over here. Sorry about this.
Okay. Oh, no problem.
There seems to be no rhyme or reason to when sometimes the Facebook Zoom servers will go down. Luckily, we found the YouTube workaround. Okay, great. People are popping in, and they'll be able to leave comments in the chat over here too. Hi, everybody. If you are joining us now over from Facebook, thanks for coming in and finding us on YouTube. This is John with Murder by the Book, and I'm really excited tonight to have Alyssa, Maxwell, and Diane Freeman here to chat with us. Just in case you were not familiar with them, let me get them introduced. Alyssa Maxwell began a love affair with the city of Newport years ago. Time and again, the colonial neighborhoods and grand mansions drew her to return, and on one of those later visits, she met the man who would become her husband. Always a lover of history, Maxwell found that marrying into a large generations old Newport family opened up an exciting new world of historical discovery. Today, she and her husband reside in Florida, but part of her heart remains firmly in that small New England city of great historical significance. How are you doing tonight, Alyssa?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
Thanks for joining us. So Alyssa's newest book in her series, Murder at King's Coat, is just recently out. So we've got signed book plates available for that. And we're also chatting with Diane Freeman, who is the acclaimed author of the Countess of Harley mystery series. Her debut novel, A Lady's Guide to Etiquette and Murder, won both an Agatha Award and a Lefty Award, and was nominated for the prestigious Mary Higgins Clark Award from the Mystery Writers of America. She spent 30 years working in corporate accounting and finance, and now she writes full-time. Born and raised in Michigan, she and her husband split their time between Michigan and Arizona. How are you doing tonight, Diane?
I'm doing very well, John.
Thank you. And so her newest book in her series has just come out, and the new one is A Lady's Guide to Mischief and Murder. And she was also kind enough to send us signed book plates for that one as well. So to get us started tonight, let's have you guys tell us a little bit about the new book. Alyssa, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, my Gilded Newport Mysteries feature Emma Cross, who's a journalist, a distant Vanderbilt cousin, and a Newporter born and raised. Now, in Murder at King's Coat, motor cars come to the island for really the first time in any great numbers. Maybe, there might have been an isolated one or two here or there. And most people in 1899 had never seen a motor car, much less driven in one. So when the members of the 400, which were New York's high society, decided to hold Newport's first ever automobile parade, it's really an occasion of great excitement. Unfortunately, that evening, a butler is struck and killed by one of these cars, which was being driven by the son of the woman who owns King's Coat. Now, it's termed a drunken accident, and Philip King is going to be charged with reckless manslaughter. But based on his behavior immediately following the incident, along with evidence that arises that several people might have wanted this butler out of the way, Emma has her doubts. So her quest to discover what happened and why sends her into a world of insane asylums, boxing rings, inheritance fraud, all of which are brand new to her, a new challenge, and a new challenge for me as well.
Awesome. And so what this is, how far into the series are we with this one?
This is number 8. And
Wow.
just this week, I finished up number 9, which will be out next summer.
And so for the series, do you recommend readers start at the beginning with Murder at the Breakers, or do you think that they can jump in with this new one without having read the earlier ones?
You know, people have commented to me that they've picked up a book in the middle of the series and had no trouble catching on to who was who and you know what was going on. Ideally, it's better to start with the first book, but you can start here and then work your way back and start from the beginning and fill in.
And Diane, do you want to tell us a little bit about the newest in your series?
Sure. I think it's kind of fun that I also write in 1899. It is October, and that is shooting season. And Frances needs to find a place to have a very quiet wedding for her sister outside of the public eye. And now she thinks she's got that opportunity when her own fiance, George Hazelton, offers his family home, Risings, for the occasion. There he is kind of maintaining the place while his brother is traveling on the continent. And there's a shooting party going on at the moment. So he says, you know, come on, bring the family. We'll end the shooting party week with a wedding. So what the heck? So she thinks her problems are all solved. Great, I just have to plan a small wedding at the end of the week. And suddenly accidents begin happening the moment they arrive at Risings, as soon as they're in the country. And they become more frequent, and they become always centered around the groom, Leo Kendrick. So Frances has to begin to wonder if these are really accidents, and her concern is that somebody is either just being malicious or somebody is trying to kill Leo. So this is one where George is kind of distracted. She's always done her sleuthing with her fiance, George, but this time he's on vacation. He's having a holiday. This is fun. I'm shooting with the guys. Come on, those aren't really accidents. And she ends up having to pretty much do this on her own. So this was kind of a good growth novel for Frances.
So this is the third in the series, correct?
It is.
And so do you recommend that people go back with the first one, or do you think that they're okay if they jump in here?
They can jump in anywhere. Because there is a certain amount of growth throughout the characters, it's kind of fun to start at the beginning and work your way through, but you really can pick up any of them and read them as standalones.
And so if you guys are watching with us live, you can leave any comments or questions for the authors in the chat here on YouTube, and I will make sure to relay any of those as we are talking. So as Diane mentioned, you guys both kind of write roughly the same time, but I wanted to know what kind of drew you to historical fiction when you were deciding what you wanted to write to start with. Let's start with you, Alyssa.
I've always loved historical fiction of any kind. So when I started to write, I just knew instinctively that I wanted to write something set in history. I think my voice lends itself to historical works rather than contemporary. As many people know, my husband was born and raised in Newport, and he's from that generations old family that's been there for such a long time. And Newport was a place that I fell in love with even before I met him. So it felt very natural to use Newport as my setting. And since the most famous aspect of Newport is the Gilded Age, it just made sense to set my stories in what would be so recognizable and relatable to so many people, because so many people visit Newport each year.
And how about you, Diane?
A similar story. I've just always loved history. I started out reading historical romances, and then more the Gothic type romance, and then just histories. Then I started reading just old books. I started reading Edith Wharton, and of course Jane Austen, and just I like Alyssa. I like that period language. I like that voice, and because of Wharton, I kind of started getting curious about the American heiresses and the transatlantic marriages. Never really thought much of it. I knew there were a couple. And then much later on, probably about the Downton Abbey time, when I went, oh, look, she's an American heiress. How about that? I started looking into it and I thought, my God, this was a thing. This was a phenomenon. There were at least 200 American heiresses, nouveau riche women, young women who married British peers. And when you take in all of Europe, it comes closer to 400. So I thought, this is fascinating. So that's what kind of drew me to this specific time period. But yeah, just basically, I'm a history lover.
And so when you guys were starting and kind of figuring out what you were going to write, did you know early on that mystery was going to be a part of it, or was it something that kind of happened as you started writing? Let's start with you, Diane, this time.
I did love mystery. I'm a big Agatha Christie fan. Those are probably my first mysteries. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got away from the more hardcore mystery, the stuff that got bloodier and scarier, and so that's where cozy and traditional mysteries kind of tickle my fancy. That's my lane. That's what I really enjoy. So yeah, I kind of always knew it was going to be a mystery.
I actually started off writing historical romance, but I always had a very strong either mystery or suspense thread running through, and it finally occurred to me that, I'm a closet mystery writer. And when I started with Murder at the Breakers was the first mystery I set my hand to, and it really just felt right to me. And you know, I've just never looked back from there. Mysteries are something that I've always loved to read, but I would say I'm more of a historical fiction fan first. And whether it's mystery or romance or Agatha Christie or Sherlock Holmes, because I'm set in history, I love it.
One of the things I love, I'm a big historical mystery or historical fiction fan, and historical mysteries and kind of cozies too. One of the things I really love about historical mysteries is even if there's not necessarily or historical fiction in general, even if there's not necessarily like a dead body or a murder to solve, they always still somehow inherently have some kind of mysterious element, whether it's, you know, it could just be family secrets. It could be like a missing artifact that somebody's looking for. So there's a lot of stuff that we love at the store that we kind of call mystery adjacent, because there's always kind of those elements, even if it's not necessarily a detective novel. So we've already kind of talked a little bit about what drew you to your specific time periods. So I think it's really interesting that you guys both write the same time period, but you're both writing it kind of on different continents. You know, like you said, Diane, your character is kind of an American heiress, but she's living in England, and Alyssa, yours are kind of American, because American historical fiction is not something that we see quite as much. It's usually kind of Europe. It usually ends up being kind of around World War I, World War II. What do you think we don't see as much set in America as we do in England?
Is that for me?
Yeah, let's go with you.
I think Americans have a fascination with all things British. I think for some readers, they really love that whole social structure with the nobility and royalty and dukes, and you know, it's kind of a fairy tale, and it's a very appealing theme to a story. But you know, of course, we have the wonderful Victoria Thompson, who's been writing her Gaslight mysteries, and those are set in New York.
Yeah.
Right. So, but you know, when you think about it, I'm writing about the families whose daughters will now go and could potentially be in Diane's books. In Murder at Marble House, I centered that story around Consuelo Vanderbilt being forced to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She was one of those American heiresses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. My original idea for Frances was just to kind of model her on these various heiresses, and then she ended up becoming a person in her own right, or a character in her own right. But yeah, I did study a lot of them, and some of the earlier ones, like the first marriages took place around 1874, 1875. And once Jenny Jerome married a Brit, and then Consuelo Isnaga, who I think was a friend of Alva Vanderbilt,
Yes.
the floodgates opened. So they had a fascination for everything British too. And I guess there's just, the mystery of the families, as Alyssa said, the generations old families, and the title that's constantly handed down. And there's just, I don't know. It is fascinating. I can't really say why there isn't more mysteries set in America, but I do understand why there's a lot set in London.
One of the things I think is interesting that you guys also do kind of differently, and Alyssa, you mentioned kind of the nobility, in Dianne, in your books, your character, she's in kind of the aristocratic, I cannot talk tonight. She's kind of in with the noble family. She was married to somebody with a title, so she comes from that world. And then in Alyssa's series, her character is kind of the poor relation of the Vanderbilts, and she's working kind of as a newspaper reporter. So can you guys talk a little bit about why you chose to make your characters kind of what social status you did, and kind of some of the challenges that might come with that? Let's start with Alyssa on this one.
It made sense to me to have a sleuth who would be able to go to some of those parties, to have entree into the great houses of Newport, while at the same time being able to mix with the townsfolk. So as a poor relation and a reporter, that kind of gave her her entrance into all levels of society. And what she maybe couldn't do on her own, she could get a relative to help her. She could get the servants network to help her through her housekeeper and good friend. So I wanted her to have that kind of, all over experience to make her job not only easier, but more fun for me. So I could explore all levels of society.
For me, the fact that it was the transatlantic marriages that brought me into this kind of dictated that my sleuth would have to be someone who married into the aristocracy. Although she's not necessarily rich, she's no Vanderbilt. They're pretty much, her husband had spent all the dowry that she brought with her. So now she's trying to make her way. And I often wondered what happened 10 years after the marriage. This didn't seem like a good basis for a marriage to me, trading cash for a title. So that's kind of what I looked at. I thought, okay, 10 years later, she's now a widow. She's trying to make it on her own. And she has always, since she was about 12, had money. She doesn't know how to boil an egg, or she doesn't know the price of anything. And one of the early Syrup books, she buys a dress and is shocked by how much it costs. And she had no idea the bills were always sent to her husband. So it's kind of fun to see her trying to stand on her own 2 feet when she is so handicapped by having been pampered all her life and been protected from the realities of life. And I just kind of enjoyed that aspect of her. Plus, with sleuthing, although her behavior is heavily monitored in the upper class, it's really hard to tell somebody with the title Countess of Harley, no, I'm not going to tell you what you're asking me. So she can be pretty audacious too, and just butt in where she's not necessarily wanted. So it's a lot of fun to write her.
Yeah. So we have a question from the crowd. Aaliyah wants to know, how much did you know about your main characters when you started writing, and how much of the characters were discovered through the writing process? Let's start with Alyssa on this one.
I really did a lot of character sketching before I started writing the book. But having said that, Emma has really evolved from book to book, and sometimes in ways that I didn't necessarily anticipate. She's had some decisions to make, and even though I'm the writer, I didn't always know which direction I wanted her to go in. Writers say sometimes the characters tell them where they want, how, what decisions they want to make, and that can be true in some ways. And it made her more alive to me to let her kind of develop naturally.
Yeah, as I had said earlier, I kind of based Frances on a conglomerate of the various eras. Eras is a little bit of Consuelo Vanderbilt, a little bit of Consuelo Isnaga, a little Jenny Jerome, but also I tend to get to know my characters more as I go through the first draft. And by the time I finish that first draft, they've told me who they are. And I am sometimes really distorting and forcing them to do things that kind of go against their character. And that's when I learn when I'm really struggling with a scene, I realize that I'm making them do something that goes against character and I have to rethink who they are. So yeah, Frances kind of ended up coming out as a different person than when I was on page 1 of draft 1. By the end of that draft, she was fully formed.
So, so Diane, do you outline when you write, or do you just kind of sit down and see where it takes you?
I didn't outline the first book, much to my regret, because I had plot holes everywhere. And it did take me about 3 years to write that first book. But now, yeah, I actually outline, I plot the crime first. And then I generally start with just a blurb, something that might appear on the cover, and then kind of lengthen that into a synopsis and then break it into chapters and outlines. So I spend a lot of time before I actually write the book, planning it.
Yeah, my process is actually very similar to that. But what I do in between the blurb and actually outlining the plot is I sketch out each character so that I know what each suspect, each secondary character wants, their goals, what they're hiding, because that has proven key to me in being able to plot my books. Because if I can make everyone look guilty, I can keep that momentum going up until those final couple of chapters. So that to me is as important as, the original concept or, the plot points. I have to know who all those characters are.
Yeah, well, I think one of the great things about mysteries is like all of the secondary characters that you're able to pull in, whether it's like the people that somebody will turn to when they're looking for a crime, in the way that, as a series develops, you get to know those characters, and maybe this time they'll pop up in a book. They might not be in another one, and they might show up like a couple books down the road. So do you guys have any secondary characters that kind of just surprise you, or that you just love kind of maybe more than the others? Well, how about you, Diane?
Well, I really like Lily. She's kind of a young Frances almost, but a very different character. She's more rebellious and she's a little spunkier than Frances was at her age. But I think Frances sees her youth in Lily's eyes, or through Lily. And Alicia Stoke-Whitney is one of my favorites. She's just totally audacious, lives the way she wants to live, and to heck with what anybody thinks. And she can be as outrageous as she wants to be. And that's always a joy to have a character like that.
What really surprised me in writing these books was how fond and how well I would get to know the Vanderbilt family. A lot of my secondary characters are historical figures. So Cornelius and Alice, Emma has a very warm relationship with them, and I feel like I do too now. Her cousin Cornelius III, who everyone called Neely, is her favorite cousin, and I really enjoyed bringing him into the stories. And his wife, Grace Wilson, who caused a horrible rift between Neely and his parents, has also become a friend of Emma's. And part of that was I wanted her to have someone who was in her corner, because the family really ostracized the couple after the marriage. But yeah, getting to know these historical figures has really changed them from icons to almost like friends and family of my own.
So can you guys talk a little bit about the research process that goes into the books? whether it's, researching the houses that they're set in, like you said, researching kind of historical figures that actually existed at the time. Let's start with you, Diane, on this one. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process?
Okay. Well, it's different for every book because I need different information for each one. For book 3, I needed a grand house, kind of like Alyssa writes about, and I needed it out in the country. And I kind of like to have a visual, an actual floor plan when I do this, so that when I move people around the house, I know where they are. So I found Audley End House, and it was set in Essex, and it worked out just perfectly for George's family home risings. It's various, where do I go for this stuff? I think that I found on British Heritage online. I do a lot with the British Library. Trains were a biggie. They traveled on a private train car. And when I started digging into various things, I found 1870s train cars. Gosh, you guys hear that thunder? Sorry. And then I found 1900s train cars, but I couldn't find any train cars for exactly what I wanted. And then a friend of mine who is Irish was working on a historical mystery also. And she found I don't remember what city it's in, darn it, so I'm not gonna be able to give them credit, but a train museum. So she taught me, or I found through her a connection to that. So sometimes it's just serendipity when you're about to give up. It's like, gosh, I'm just gonna have to make up what this train car looks like. And really, would anybody really care what that train car looked like except me? But it's then you find somebody who knows a guy and they connect you, and then you find out. And a lot of it works like that, just talking to people about what you need. My sister's a nurse, and she helps me a lot with, okay, what kind of wound would actually kill you? And what might just injure you a bit, and how would your recovery be, and things of that nature. So friends, family, other writers, and then of course, the newspaper archives and the museums and the libraries as well. A little bit of everything.
I have been so lucky with this series because there is such a wealth of information about Newport and those houses. I use resources from the Preservation Society of Newport County. I love archived newspaper files. I could spend hours just poring over old newspaper articles, and I have for various of these books, including Kingscote, quite a bit. My husband, of course, is a treasure trove of information. We're lucky that his father and his grandfather were both amateur photographers. So we have tons and tons of pictures of old Newport. It's just been a real joy to do this kind of research. And, like I said, there's just no shortage of information about these people, their houses, and that time period. It's really well written about.
That is one good thing about this time period too, is it's still, a lot of technology was already there, newspapers and archiving them. And people kept diaries, people really recorded stuff. It's a really good time period to have if you want to do research, because it's all still there.
So when you're doing your research, how do you decide, like, if you can't find details, like if you hadn't found information about the train car, and like how do you decide at what point do you think, okay, I'm going to stop looking for this and I'm just going to make it up and get it as close as I can to what will work for the situation?
For me, it's when my deadline shows up, when I'm out of time. Otherwise, I'll just keep trying until I get there. But yeah, and it has happened. I've actually been able to get some information and put it in when the manuscript comes back for copy edits. So I kind of never give up.
And how about you, Alyssa?
Yeah, same here. I hate to give up on something. I'll start asking people. And in fact, I had somebody get me information on a certain house in Newport that I haven't been in such a long time. I couldn't remember what it looked like inside. And she happened to be going to lunch there a couple of weeks ago. And she took a bunch of pictures for me and drew me a floor plan. So, you know, whatever it takes, you can almost always find that elusive little detail. But if I can't, and I have to use my information, my imagination, you know, for instance, the gardens of these mansions are pretty much all gone now. The upkeep on them is just too much. So if I use my imagination on something, I'll include that in my author's notes in the back of the book, just to let people know that, you know, sometimes we have to fill in with a little fiction.
So I find you guys both write kind of mysteries that are on the lighter side. Like I think you both mentioned kind of being big fans of Agatha Christie. And I feel like especially with lighter mysteries, there are kind of two kinds of writers. There are the ones that have the dead body boom by the end of the first chapter. And then there are writers who kind of let you get to know the victim. Maybe like you don't find the dead body till like 70 or 80 pages in. Which kind of writer are you, or are you a mix of both? Let's start with Diane on this one.
I'm a mix. Gosh, I think in the first book, it was probably about chapter 5 that we had the dead body. And in book 2, it was right at the end of the first chapter. Book 3, again, you started having accidents, and then finally a dead body. And in book 4, I'm a little bit earlier. So yeah, I either go back and forth or I do a mixture.
How about you, Alyssa?
I don't think I've ever waited until page 70, but I think around page 30 is about when I usually have the first dead body show up. But I also like to put in a little mystery within the mystery. So I'll start off with something puzzling or something that's not, you know, sitting well with my sleuth. So she may actually start a little bit of sleuthing before anybody has died.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like her character lends itself well, being kind of a newspaper reporter. You know, she's not quite kind of the amateur sleuth that, you know, is kind of trying to figure it out. So it's a great plot device to be able to kind of get her to get that information and be able to, like you said, kind of ask questions. So we had a question from Shelley in the comments. She wants to know where you get your inspirations for the actual murders or crimes in the books. Let's start with Diane on this one.
Geez, that's a tough one. I think the plot, a couple of different things. Just generally what I need to happen to the character. In book 3, I needed Frances. She's engaged to George. She's had a really horrible marriage before. And marriage in general at that time was not really a good bargain for a woman. So she can live alone. She loves George. She's just not sure what she's getting into with him. So I needed her to kind of get her confidence to the point where she goes from avoiding the topic altogether, how are we going to live together, to being able to address it. So I needed the type of murder where it was questionable. Were these just accidents? You know, are you sure? So I needed something that, like I said, George needed to be distracted. So that's where I came up with, okay, we're going to have accidents. He's going to be having a really good time. So he's kind of blowing them off, and Frances is going to take over. And that's where she's going to get her confidence from. In the second book, it was a similar type of situation. It depended on how I needed the characters to progress, would kind of dictate, not necessarily the murder, but what kind of crime I needed to have happen. Does that help, I hope?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't heard an author explain it kind of that way before, that like you said, kind of the type of crime would kind of impact kind of the growth of the character. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
How about you, Alyssa?
I tend to take whatever situation the characters are in. For instance, in Murder at the Breakers, there was the first big party at the newly rebuilt Breakers. So I had someone whacked and pushed off the balcony, the second floor balcony. In the one I just finished up, there's an Elizabethan themed party, and a person is shot with a bow and arrow. So I try to keep it in fitting with whatever kind of party or, you know, ball is going on at the time. But I just finished up my 15th mystery, and I don't have an initial murder the same way in any of those books. And so I think I do. I look at all the different ways you can kill a person, and I have fun with it. You know, sometimes they're quirky. Motor car becomes a weapon, because that was the big thing happening in 1899. I thought, well, what better way to kill the first person in the story than with a car? So I try to make it fun and in keeping with the story.
So Anita asks in the comments, how did you research police techniques for the time period that you were writing in? Let's start with Diane.
Again, I'd probably go back to the British newspaper archives, because there is various police periodicals in there, the Illustrated Police Gazette. And they do necessarily, when they're discussing particular cases that they've solved, you do get a little bit of how it did, how they worked it out. The science is not always that clear. So I tend to feel like maybe I don't have to be that clear. But if I can find out, I will. Specifically, things like fingerprints, fortunately for me, don't come into play yet. They will pretty soon. We're getting there, but not yet. And that's all just kind of, gosh, I don't know, digging into the various archives that I can find.
Is it easier if your character isn't, since they're kind of an amateur sleuth and they're not actually kind of a police officer, is it easier for you to kind of fudge a little there since they're solving the crime and they don't have a police background?
I think so, because mine is also first person. So you only get to see what Frances sees, and she would not be in the police lab doing any of this work. So I don't generally focus on that.
And how about you, Alyssa?
Emma does sometimes work with the police. She has a friend on the police force, and she is sometimes in there, you know, while Jesse's working, Jesse White, the detective. But again, you know, as Diane said, the science really wasn't developed yet. There weren't a lot of forensic techniques. So I keep it, I kind of gloss it a bit, you know, and I keep it in Emma's point of view. Now, with my Lady and Ladies Maid mysteries, I do a little bit more because they have fingerprints. They had some lab testing by then. You know, forensics was in its infancy, but they had their techniques. So that I've actually used, you know, some books, you know, nonfiction books that I found at our local mystery bookstore that they keep on hand to help us writers write the type of thing.
One other thing is, back in that era, like Alyssa said, the science wasn't there, but a lot of times the motivation wasn't really there either. There was a lot of crime, and if they could find the usual suspects, let's say, then they would generally start there first. But I don't know this for a fact in London, but I do know in New York, if you wanted somebody to solve your crime, you have a missing person or something like that, you might often have to offer a bribe to get them to do it. So a lot of crime just wasn't solved in the early days of policing.
I bring in the filter brought on the police from the members of 400. Solve this case now, or don't accuse this particular person, don't accuse my son. And that actually put a lot of pressure on the police to do their job one way or another, you know, fairly or not.
So Alyssa, so you mentioned the other series, so you're doing 2 books a year, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
So how do you keep up with that, and how do you keep kind of the 2 series kind of separate?
Is that backwards? It's probably backwards.
No, it's not backwards. You're good.
Oh, good. I write a book every 6 months, and I completely compartmentalize the 2. I may have to proof copy edits or proof a final galley copy of the previous book, but other than that, when I'm done with the Newport book, I put myself into a 1920 Cotswolds village and that grand estate there. And I've never had any trouble separating the two. I don't get my characters mixed up. The only thing that I have done is, since the Lady and Lady's Maid is in third person, sometimes I'll start a gilded Newport mystery and start off writing in third person or vice versa, and I have to stop myself and say, no. But otherwise, I really enjoy doing the two, and I'm, doing 2 books a year is doable, and I enjoy that too.
And so Diane, how long does it take you to finish a book?
It takes me as long as I guess. I literally, I just managed to fill that time. If I had a year and a half, it would take me a year and a half. But I get about, well, from the time I start my outline to the end of the book, I have about a year.
It's always crazy to me for authors like Diane mentioned, like it took 3 years to write the first book, and then just kind of the way publishing works now and just kind of the way the world works now, people are always hungry for new content. So you finish the first book and you can take however long, and then you have this contract and all of a sudden you have to like figure out how to write another one in a year and turn around something else. And then potentially do some short stories and stuff like that too. So it's always interesting to me to hear writers kind of talk about.
It's very scary, that sophomore
kind of
novel.
of
Do you remember, Alyssa, when you first had to write your first book under contract? It's like, can I do this?
It's scary.
Yeah.
It's a great motivator though, because I never wanted to be that author who doesn't make their deadline.
Oh God, no.
That kept me going.
From the crowd, somebody asked, Pooh Bear asks, how are the heroines going to embrace the changes coming in the 20th century? He mentioned that he thinks Emma is already there, kind of a new woman. But so is that something you guys have thought about, kind of how the characters are going to embrace kind of the coming change with history? Let's start with Diane.
Frances she will embrace it. She always looks to the future. She's endlessly fascinated with everything, and she does love technology and photography and the various inventions. She's not real excited about the automobile just yet, and you'll see that coming up, but mainly just because she doesn't feel like it's been tested enough and it's just not very comfortable. But yeah, she'll try anything. I think Frances will go running into the 20th century.
And how about you, Alyssa?
Yeah, Emma is a very big proponent of women. She, believes that women should have many more choices than they do. She never loses sight of the fact that there are obstacles, and if she crosses a line, she understands that there'll be consequences, because that was life. She doesn't ignore the barriers for women, but she finds her way around them or under them. One of the things I loved about Murder at King's Coat was that the woman who owned the house, Ella King, and her daughter Gwendolyn were very much the early 20th century woman, kind of the Gibson girl type. At least the daughter was. They were more athletic. They were more involved in, their local politics, women's clubs, philanthropy, especially to help women and children. So it really was a time during the Gilded Age when women started to, come out of the home and be much more involved in their communities.
So when somebody finishes one of your books, what do you want them to take away from it when they've finished the last chapter, they've closed it? What is that one, like the thing that you want them to take away with it as they kind of go off into the world? Let's start with Diane.
I just basically want them to kind of feel very satisfied. This is escapist fiction, and I do it to entertain you and hopefully keep you kind of off balance as you're reading until you actually get to the end and realize, okay, that's what happened. But I basically want them to kind of smile, close the book and say, yeah, bring me the next one.
I agree with that. I want people to have felt challenged by the plot, by the mystery, and engaged with the characters and feel like they were part of the story, part of the gang. And you know, if I can do that, then I'm just very happy.
Yeah.
So as readers, we'll start with Diane. As a reader, when you're reading a mystery, are you trying to figure it out as you go along, or are you just kind of are along for the ride and you just want who did it to be a surprise to you?
Most of the time, I'll admit I just want the fun ride. But there are times, probably the darker mysteries, I'm usually, maybe because they're dark and I kind of want to pull away a little bit, that's when I'm examining the actual clues and the red herrings and which are which, and I'm being more, I don't know, more involved in the mystery itself. But most of the time, I just want to enjoy myself.
How about you, Alyssa?
Same here. I'm there for the ride. This is my downtime. This is my relaxation. I don't want to work. I just want to absorb a good story and have fun with some great characters.
I'm the same way, and I find if I figure it out early on, then I'm upset. So yeah, I like to be along for the ride as well. So we've got just a couple more minutes before we tune out for this evening. So I wanted to ask you guys about kind of along with the reading question, what's something that you've read recently that you just loved? Let's start with Alyssa this time.
Oh my goodness. I have been catching up since this whole pandemic with a lot of my friends' books, which has been great. I've read a new Scottish series by a friend of mine, Tracy Hall. Kathleen Bridge writes books. Her Hamptons home. I'm going to say this wrong, but if they're set in the Hamptons, and they actually involve houses a lot of, you know, very much like what I write about. I've read some Kate Parker. I've also indulged in a little historical fiction, which I said I love. Beatrice Williams is a favorite of mine.
Mine too.
Yeah. Susanna Kearsley, Tracy Chevalier. So I've caught up on some, you know, authors and books that I just, you know, maybe didn't make enough time for previously. I'm just burning through and having a lot of fun doing it.
How about you, Diane?
I just this weekend finished Reese Bowen's latest, The Last Mrs. Summers, her latest sleuth, I forget. Georgie. Yeah, Lady Georgie book. And a while back, I read Anne Parker's, the most recent one in the Silver Rush series. And I'm not going to remember the name of it. So I went back to the beginning, and I'm reading Silver Lies now. We have Silver Lies. Oh, that is backwards. How come mine is backwards? Oh, you're seeing it all right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just about to start that one. For 2 years, I've been trying to get to Paris, and it hasn't worked out. First, there were some health issues in the family, and now we're not traveling anywhere. So I love Jen McKinley's mysteries, so I picked up her latest romance. Paris is always a good idea. And I'll get to that pretty soon, too. So just whatever I'm finding, I'm writing quite a bit, too.
The date, I think, is going to change from what we've got currently scheduled, but we're going to be doing a virtual event with Jen McKinley and Marty Wingate a little bit later in the fall. And since Alyssa mentioned Susanna Kearsley, who we're also big fans of, she had a anthology come out today with her, Annalee Huber, Christine Trent, and C.S. Harris called Deadly Hours. I'm going to be chatting with them on September 11th. And then when Annalee Huber's new book comes out in October, we'll be chatting with her too. So if you guys are watching, definitely check the Murder Books website. It's murderbooks.com to see kind of what we've got coming up. If you guys joined us late, we've been talking with Alyssa Maxwell about her newest book, Murder in King's Coat. And we've also been talking with Diane Freeman about her new book, A Lady's Guide to Mischief and Murder. We have both in stock, as well as the earlier ones in the series at Murder by the Book. We have signed book plates to go with the books. So any of their books that you order, we've got signed book plates that we will tuck in there. I just wanted to mention a couple things about the store status-wise. We are just now starting to take appointments. So if you have missed coming in and being able to browse, you can make appointments. We're doing them in the afternoons. So you can give us a call or visit the website to make an appointment to come in. Of course, we're still doing curbside pickup and phone orders and web orders through murderbooks.com. So you can definitely check us out there. Thank you, ladies, again so much for chatting with us this evening. This has been really wonderful. Alyssa mentioned before that she had been talking about wanting to be able to come to the store when she was here for the Kensington Cozy Con. So I'm sorry we couldn't have you in person, but I'm glad we could figure out still a way to chat. So hopefully next time you guys both have something out, we'll be able to do it to here in Houston.
Thank you, John.
The
Thank
upside
you.
is you're missing, thank you. The upside is you're missing our like 115-degree heat index. So you don't have to worry about that right now. But again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you guys missed the beginning of the chat on YouTube, YouTube will archive it as soon as we're done and you'll be able to catch it there. So y'all have a good evening and thanks so much for chatting with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.